The roar of the crowd still echoed across center court. The scoreboard above the grass read 6-0, 6-2. Alex Eala had just produced one of the most commanding performances of her grass court career, dismantling Australia's Priscilla Hahn in little more than an hour. Every part of her game had clicked. The left-handed serve found its targets. The forehand exploded through the court. Her movement looked effortless. For the thousands of fans packed inside Edgbaston Priory Club, it felt less like a first-round match and more like a celebration. Philippine flags rippled throughout the stands. Chants of Laban, Laban, Laban rolled from one section to another like waves. Many had traveled hundreds, even thousands, of miles to see her play. Some came from London, others from Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Cardiff. A few had flown directly from the Philippines. For them, this was more than tennis. It was pride. It was representation. It was home. As Eala approached the umpire's chair and exchanged handshakes, the applause grew even louder. She smiled and raised her racket in acknowledgement. The tournament interviewer stepped forward and handed her a microphone. The crowd slowly settled. Everyone expected the standard post-match interview. A few comments about the match. A thank you to her opponent. Perhaps a brief mention of the next round. Instead, Eala looked around the stadium. She saw the flags. She saw the children wearing shirts with her name. She saw elderly fans wiping tears from their eyes. For a moment, emotion washed across her face. "Maraming salamat sa suporta," she said. "Thank you so much for your support." The reaction was immediate. The crowd exploded. A deafening roar rolled through the stadium. Eala laughed softly and shook her head in disbelief. "I didn't expect there to be so many Filipinos here," she continued. Another roar. Another eruption of cheers. Then she smiled. "See you all tomorrow." The stadium erupted again. Thousands of voices joined together.
Eala.
Eala. Eala. Laban Alex. Laban. The atmosphere felt electric. Almost unreal. As the interview ended, Eala began walking toward the section where many of her youngest supporters were gathered. Security personnel watched carefully, but remained relaxed. Nothing seemed unusual. Then she spotted a little girl in the front row. The child couldn't have been older than 8. She held a handmade sign decorated with markers and glitter. Across the cardboard were the words, "Laban Alex Laban." Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks. When their eyes met, the child stretched out her hand. Instinctively, Eala reached back. The moment was simple.
Pure.
Human. A champion reaching toward a fan reaching toward her hero. But the crowd saw it. And suddenly, everyone wanted their own moment. People stood, then leaned forward, then pushed closer. Phones shot into the air. Voices shouted. Security guards immediately exchanged nervous glances. The movement spread through the stands faster than anyone anticipated. Rows that had remained orderly throughout the match suddenly compressed toward the barriers. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Fans stretched out their arms. Some called her name. Others waved flags. Everyone wanted just a second of contact. Just one photo. One autograph. One memory. Within moments, security realized the situation was changing.
Fast.
Additional personnel rushed toward the courtside area. A supervisor grabbed his radio. "We need support near the player exit." The pressure against the barriers continued to build. Eala froze for a moment. Her smile faded into concern. She could see security officers moving urgently around her. She could hear instructions being shouted. The little girl was quickly guided backward into a safer position. 2 guards stepped beside Eala. Not aggressively.
Protectively.
Creating space. Creating order. The crowd wasn't hostile. Quite the opposite. They loved her. That was the problem. The passion had become overwhelming. More security officers arrived. The barriers held. But only just. One official later admitted the atmosphere felt less like a tennis tournament and more like a sold-out concert. Eala glanced back toward the fans. Many were still calling her name. Many looked disappointed as security gently encouraged everyone to step back. Before leaving, she raised her hand one final time. The crowd responded with another thunderous roar. Then, Surrounded by tournament staff, she was escorted toward the players' tunnel. The chants followed her all the way. Laban, Laban, Laban. Even after she disappeared from sight, the noise continued. The fans remained standing, still waving flags, still singing, still celebrating. Inside the tunnel, Eala finally exhaled. Her heart was racing. Not because of the match, not because of the score, because of what she had just witnessed. The connection between athlete and supporters had become something much larger than tennis. Outside, social media was already exploding. Videos of the moment spread across platforms within minutes. One clip showed the young girl holding her sign. Another captured the sea of Philippine flags. A third showed security rushing forward as the crowd surged. Millions of views followed. Then millions more. News outlets picked up the footage. Sports channels replayed it repeatedly. Commentators debated the scene. Some called it unprecedented for a WTA 125 tournament. Others called it proof of Eala's growing global influence. But for those who had been inside the stadium, the explanation was simple. They had witnessed something rare. Not merely popularity, not merely fandom. Connection. The kind of connection that cannot be manufactured. The kind that turns spectators into believers. And as the sun began to set over Birmingham, one truth became impossible to ignore. Alexandra Eala had arrived at the tournament as the top seed. She had left the court as something much bigger. A symbol. A source of pride. A player capable of making thousands of people feel seen with nothing more than a smile, a few words, and a willingness to walk toward the crowd. The tournament would continue. More matches awaited. More challenges stood ahead. But long after the final score was forgotten, many would remember the image of a young champion standing before a sea of waving flags while thousands of voices chanted her name. Not because she won, because she connected. And sometimes, in sport, that becomes the most powerful victory of all. She leaned forward. She extended her own hand to meet the child's. And then, the surge. The fans in the rows behind the barrier, who had been pressing forward for the entire match, saw Eala approaching and collectively lost their restraint. What had been an orderly crowd became a human wave pushing toward the court. Philippine flags waved wildly. Phones rose in unison, capturing the moment. Voices shouted over one another in a chaotic chorus of Tagalog and English. Alex. Alex. Over here. Laban. Laban. Please, just one photo. Security officials who had been standing at ease suddenly snapped to attention. Two guards sprinted toward Eala, cutting between her and the surging crowd. Another guard grabbed the little girl's hand and pulled her back behind the barrier, away from the crush of bodies. In just 64 minutes, Alexandra Eala had dismantled Australia's Priscilla Hahn 6-0, 6-2, delivering one of the most commanding grass-court performances of her career. The crowd inside Edgbaston Priory Club rose to its feet, applauding a display of tennis that left little doubt about who controlled the court from the opening point. Yet the scoreline would not be what people remembered. Hours later, social media would be flooded with videos. Television commentators would debate what happened. Tournament officials would hold emergency meetings. Security procedures would be reviewed overnight. And at the center of it all stood a 21-year-old Filipina whose connection with her supporters had become something far bigger than tennis. Birmingham, England, June 2nd, 2026. The atmosphere around the Lexus Birmingham Open had been building for days. Fans carrying Philippine flags filled the grounds long before Eala stepped onto center court. Some had traveled from London. Others arrived from Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Cardiff. A few had even flown directly from the Philippines. For many, seeing Alexandra Eala compete in person wasn't simply a sporting event. It was a celebration. Everywhere she went, supporters followed. Children wore shirts bearing her name. Families carried handmade signs. Elderly fans proudly displayed Philippine colors across their shoulders. The tournament had seen popular players before, but this felt different. There was an energy in the air that officials struggled to describe. When Eala emerged from the tunnel, the reaction was immediate. The crowd erupted. Flags waved. Phones rose into the air. And chants of Laban, Laban
Laban.
rolled across the stadium. Even neutral spectators found themselves caught up in the moment. The noise felt more like a Davis Cup tie than a WTA 125 tournament. Across the net stood Priscilla Honourable. The Australian knew exactly how dangerous Eala could be. The two players had split their previous meetings, making this a decisive rubber match between familiar opponents. But from the first game, it became clear that Eala had arrived in Birmingham with a different level of confidence. Her serve found its targets. Her footwork was flawless. Her timing on grass looked effortless. Han struggled to keep pace. Game after game slipped away. The first set lasted just 22 minutes. 6-0. The crowd sensed they were witnessing something special. The second set offered little relief. Eala continued attacking, moving aggressively and striking with precision from both wings. Before long, she had built a commanding lead and stood on the verge of a rare double bagel victory. Han fought back bravely, claiming 2 games and earning loud applause for her resilience. But the outcome had already been decided. Minutes later, a final backhand drifted long. Match over. Eala raised her arms. The stadium exploded. The moment everything changed as tradition dictated, Eala completed the post-match routine. Handshake. Umpire acknowledgement. Equipment gathered. Then came the interview. A tournament official handed her the microphone. The crowd gradually settled. Everyone expected the standard response. A few comments about the match. Praise for her opponent. Maybe a mention of the next round. Instead, Eala looked toward the stands. Toward the sea of Philippine flags. Toward the families who had spent hours waiting for a glimpse of their champion. And she spoke directly to them. Maraming salamat sa suporta, she said warmly. Thank you very much for the support. The crowd erupted instantly. Eala smiled. Then she added a simple sentence. I didn't expect there to be so many Filipinos here. See you all tomorrow. The reaction was deafening. People cheered. Flags waved even harder. Some supporters wiped away tears. For a brief moment, it felt less like a tennis tournament and more like a homecoming celebration. Then Eala began walking toward the stands. She noticed a group of young fans gathered near the front row. One little girl held a handmade sign reading, Laban Alex Laban. The child's eyes were filled with tears. Eala smiled and moved closer. She extended her hand. The young fan reached back. And suddenly, everything changed. The surge what happened next occurred in seconds. Fans pressed forward. More people stood up. Others moved closer to the barrier. Everyone wanted a photo, a wave, a handshake, a memory they could keep forever. The pressure increased. Security personnel immediately noticed the movement. Radios crackled. Instructions were shouted. Officials rushed toward the area. But the momentum of the crowd continued growing. What began as excitement quickly became concern. The barriers strained. People leaned forward. Security teams reacted instantly. 2 guards stepped between Eala and the crowd. Another moved behind her. A protective corridor formed around the tournament's top seed. For the first time all afternoon, Eala appeared genuinely surprised. She looked toward the supporters, then toward security, then back toward the crowd. The love was obvious, but so was the danger. Within moments, she was gently escorted away from the barrier. Additional personnel arrived. The crowd was pushed back. Order was restored. No injuries. No arrests. No serious incidents. But the image had already been captured. Alex Eala, surrounded by security officers, being guided away from a crowd desperate to get closer. It would become one of the most talked about moments of the tournament. Going viral, the first videos appeared online within minutes. Then came more. Different angles, different perspectives, different reactions. By evening, millions had watched the footage. Sports pages shared it. News outlets discussed it. Fans debated it. Some blamed tournament organizers for underestimating Eala's popularity. Others argued that security protocols should have anticipated such a large emotional response. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The scene revealed just how enormous Eala's following had become. This wasn't ordinary fan support. This was something bigger, something powerful, something that continued to grow every time she stepped onto a tennis court. And perhaps that was the most remarkable part of the entire story. Alex Eala had won the match 6-0, 6-2. Yet the tennis itself was no longer the headline. The headline was the connection, the bond between a player and her supporters. A relationship so passionate that, for one unforgettable moment in Birmingham, it overwhelmed everything else. The tournament would continue. More matches would be played. More victories and defeats would follow. But long after the final trophy was lifted, people would still remember the afternoon when thousands of fans surged forward for a single chance to thank the player who had inspired them. Because some moments transcend the scoreboard. And this was one of them.